From the 1880s until the First World War, Western Europe and the United States witnessed the development of Art Nouveau, which means new art. Art Nouveau took inspiration from the unruly aspects of the natural world. The movement influenced art and architecture, especially in the applied arts, graphic design, and illustration. Flowing lines and whiplash curves were derived, in part from botanical studies and illustrations of deep-sea organisms, such as those by German biologist Ernst Heinrich Haeckel in his book Art Forms in Nature, published in 1899. Other publications advocated nature as the primary source of inspiration for a generation of artists that were seeking to break away from past styles. The unfolding of Art Nouveau's flowing line may be understood as a metaphor for the freedom and release sought by its practitioners and admirers from the weight of artistic tradition and critical expectations of university. The term Art Nouveau first appeared in the 1880s in the Belgian journal L'Art Moderne. Much of the artistic community throughout Europe and America responded to some of the leading 19th century theoreticians, such as critic John Ruskin, who we talked about in the last lecture, who advocated for the unity of the arts, arguing against segregation between the fine arts of painting and sculpture and the so-called lesser decorative arts. They were also deeply influenced by the socially aware teachings of William Morris, who we also talked about in the arts and crafts movement. So Art Nouveau designers were very similar to the arts and crafts as they were looking to create a total work of art. The aesthetic is a little bit different. Here in the slide, you can see an example from Victor Horta and Henry van de Velde's Hotel Tassel, which exhibits the unification of all these elements of design, from the architecture to the interior detailing, down to the furnishings and the signage. Here you can see those flowing lines and the whiplash curves of the Art Nouveau, again in the Hotel Tassel by Victor Horta and Henry van de Velde. And here's just another look at those lines and shapes. They're taken from nature. So particularly those botanical studies and the illustrations of deep-sea organisms that we mentioned. I feel like you can almost see the flowing curves of jellyfish and other sea creatures in all of these design examples. This is the Hotel Solvay. It's also designed by Victor Horta. It's in Brussels, Belgium. It was designed in 1900. If you look over the door panel, you see a lot of those whiplash curves, again, that I keep talking about. This is also the Hotel Solvay. On the interior, you see more flowing lines in the railings and all of those architectural elements. Again, Hotel Solvay, so you can see more interior detailing and hopefully get a sense of how something that's talking about these influence from sea creatures and flowing lines and whiplash curves, how that all gets translated to the interior design. Here, I feel like the ceiling actually even looks like almost leaf patterns, or maybe even just like looking like jellyfish coming up through in the ceiling. This is actually Victor Horta's house and studio in Brussels, Belgium. So if you just look at the exterior, you can see a lot of that same line work, the whiplash curves, more like elliptical shapes, these long, flowing, sinuous lines. And then even in the close-up of that balcony ironwork, you can see those details there. So in December of 1895, there was a German-born Parisian art dealer. His name was Siegfried Bing. He opened a gallery called La Maison de l'Art Nouveau for the contemporary decor that he exhibited and sold there. Objects like this picture were sold there with its trendy whiplash curve handle. Bing sold art, decorative objects, and furniture like this piece by Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Mackintosh is a really important figure, although his work actually spans several different styles. So this is a piece of his that fits really well into the Art Nouveau category. We see those elliptical curved elements, reminiscent of whiplash curves that sort of breaks up the leaded glass, and the natural looking tile pieces that are shaped like tulips popping up through the ground. But we'll talk more about Mackintosh a little later in the lecture because he has a pretty unique style. So in Paris, the Art Nouveau movement captured the imagination of the public at a large 1900 exposition at Universal, the last and grandest of a series of fairs organized every 11 years from 1798. Various structures showcase the innovative style, including the Porte Monumental entrance, which actually had a really elaborate polychromatic dome with electronic lights that was designed by René Binet. This is the Pavilion Bleu. It was a restaurant alongside the Porte de Lena at the foot of the Eiffel Tower. All of these things were done for the exposition. So the exposition's pavilions featured the work of Gustave Beauvais, shown in this slide alongside the design work of Siegfried Bing's series of 6 domestic interiors, which included some symbolist art. Sharing elements from French Rococo, including stylized motifs derived from nature and fantasy and Japanese art, the furnishings exhibited here were produced in the new taste and yet perpetuated an acclaimed tradition of French craftsmanship. Through Bing's gallery is credited with the popularization of the movement and its name. Art Nouveau style reached an international audience through the vibrant graphic arts printed in such periodicals as The Savoy, La Plume, Jugend, Decorative Kunst, The Yellow Book, and The Studio. The Studio featured the bold, symbolist-inspired linear drawings of Aubrey Beardsley. This is Beardsley's flamboyant black and white print for Oscar Wilde's play Salome. I like to give a little bit of extra character so that people really understood what the Art Nouveau time period was like. There's a couple of other influential graphic artists, including Alphonse Mucha, Jules Charest, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who just happens to be one of my personal favorites, but you might have seen his work before. He has these really vibrant posters, the art that often expressed sort of a variety of roles of women in what they called at the time the Belle Epoque Society. So he was illustrating women from the femme nouvelle, which meant the new woman who rejected the conventional ideas of femininity and domesticity and subservience, to the demi-monde. If you've never heard this term demi-monde before, it refers to a group of people who live a pretty hedonistic lifestyle, usually in a pretty flagrant and conspicuous way. Partiers, basically. So the term was commonly used in Europe from the late 18th to the early 19th century, and modern use often refers to that time period when we hear the term demi-monde. Its connotation is pleasure-seeking, contrasted with wealth and high-class behavior, made it comparable to the later sort of jet-set lifestyles. The term was often used as one of disappropriation, the behavior of a person in the demi-monde being contrary to more traditional or bourgeois values. Such behaviors included drinking and drug use, gambling, high spending, particularly in pursuit of fashion, as through like clothing, as well as servants in the house, and a little bit of sexual promiscuity too. The term demi-monde referred to a woman who embodied these qualities. Later, it actually became a euphemism for the courtesan or the prostitute. So I bring that up. Some of you in cultural references might have seen a movie called Moulin Rouge. That is where Henri Toulouse-Lautrec actually painted a lot of his very famous paintings. And that's where the work that you're seeing in this poster comes from the dances that he saw at the Moulin Rouge. So the Art Nouveau font actually has a very particular style to it, and it takes on quite a bit of the look of the architecture. So we'll see how these stylized types resemble the whiplash curves and a little bit of some of the architectural aesthetics. Female figures are very often incorporated into artwork and jewelry in the form of fairies and sirens. The images here show several examples of that. Alphonse Mucha, who I mentioned previously as a graphic designer and jeweler, was an artist that was quite fond of women with long flowing hair and flowers all around, which is really typical of much of the art and taste of this era. If you've ever been to Paris, you would definitely recognize these little structures. Art Nouveau style was particularly associated with France, where it was called variously Art Belle Epoque or Le Style Metro, and it was called that after Hector Guimard's iron and glass subway entrances that are pictured here in the slide. So if you go to Paris today, you still use Hector Guimard's subway entrances. Here again, we see another example of the glass subway entrance. And I just wanted to show another example because you can really see it in this image. It definitely reminds me of sea creatures. I don't know what it looks like to you, but I see like the spines of and fins of fish and all sorts of organisms. On the left, there's a little picture, just more from Guimard's subway entrances, but on the right, you see a larger image of the Maison Colette. So it's a little bit more of an example of how we see some of the Japanese influence coming into the architecture, but within the context of a very Art Nouveau form. Here we see more examples of whiplash curves in the gate entry to the vestibule of Castel Berenger, which is just a private apartment. So you see all the whiplash curves and flowing lines in the ironwork of the doors. Hector Guimard is also an artist. He's not just a designer, which also makes sense with this style of architecture because it's a much more artistic style. Again, we see the examples of elliptical shapes, sort of the skeletal shapes of the work. So part of the broader Modernista movement in Barcelona, its chief supporter was the architect and designer of the Sagrada Familia Cathedral, which is Antonio Gaudí. His work is sometimes referred to as bone-like, which I think you can really see in this image of the entrance to the Sagrada Familia. Generally, you can see like the artistic intent and departure from traditional forms of architecture in cathedrals. Here, the columns actually look as if they're being like pulled and stretched, like almost thinking about like ligaments and tendons stretching. Here, the spires look like they are dripping. I always make this funny reference to making drip sandcastles at the beach. Like if you've ever put wet sand through your hand and just let it sort of drip through the bottom and made this sort of like drippy sandcastle tower, that's what Antonio Gaudí's work, particularly here at the Sagrada Familia, reminds me of. None of that is technical terminology, but it's just something that it always makes me think of. Casa Batlló is perhaps an even better example of the sort of like bony skeletal look that I was talking about. Here, I think you can well see the exhibit of sort of this like knuckly, bony kind of look. And this is another project nearby Casa Mila, which is known as La Pedrera, which actually means rock quarry. It was begun in 1904. It is a large 6-story apartment house built around open courtyards. And it's got sort of this like rippling cement exterior with iron-railed balconies, and it's a really good example of how Galli created these fantastic curving sculptural forms. But again, it really takes on that like bony skeletal look. We talked about Tiffany in the last lecture. So Tiffany style in America was named for the legendary Favre glass designer Louis Comfort Tiffany. Peacocks are a very popular form in the Art Nouveau style, and this is an example of it in America. Although international in scope, Art Nouveau was a pretty short-lived moment, whose sort of brief incandescence was a precursor to modernism. Modernism emphasizes function over form and the elimination of any superfluous ornament. Although a reaction to historic revivalism, it brought some of those Victorian excesses to a dramatic end. So, Art Nouveau inspired graphics became popular again in the turbulent social and political 1960s. So, some of the things like the graphic design might actually look kind of familiar to you. But this new generation, challenging conventional tastes and ideas of the 1960s, went back to the Art Nouveau style and was very inspired by the work. There's other style centers included in Austria and Hungary where Art Nouveau was called several other things, like the Secession still, or what we'll also refer to as the Vienna Secession in the next several slides. So the Vienna Secession was formed by a group of artists and designers who withdrew from the Vienna Academy to basically protest against the Academy's conservatism and their refusal to accept their modernist works. So the Vienna Secession was founded on April 3rd, 1897. The founding members included painters and sculptors and architects like Gustav Klimt, Koloman Moser, Joseph Hoffmann, Joseph Ulbrich, Max Kurzweil, and several others. The first president of the secession was Gustav Klimt. The piece shown in the slide is Klimt's Beethoven Frieze, which was displayed in a secessionist exhibition. On the upper left is the publicity poster for the event. So think about this. A whole bunch of kids basically withdrew from the academy saying that we want to continue to do our modernist work, and they started putting together their own exhibitions. That's what's going on here. You probably know Gustav Klimt best for his work, The Kiss, which has been massively reproduced for posters and cards into the present day. Joseph Ulbrich designed the Secessionist Gallery in Vienna as that exhibition space and headquarters for the movement. It became known simply as the Secession. The building is very symmetrical and rectilinear in form, but with a nature-related decorative motif, like Medusa faces, and the large hollow metal dome that is made up of gilded leaves that covers the top of the building. Here we get a closer look at both of those things. Unlike other movements, there's not one style that unites all of the work or all of the artists who are part of the Vienna Secession. But the Secession building essentially could be considered as the icon of the movement. Above its entrance was carved the phrase, "To every age its art, and to art its freedom." Secessionist artists were concerned above all else with exploring the possibilities of art outside of the confines of academic tradition. The Secessionist style was exhibited in a magazine that the group produced called Vers Sacrum, which featured highly decorative works representative of the period. Otto Wagner was another prominent architect who became associated with the Vienna Secession, although he was not a founding member. During this time, architects focused on bringing purer geometric forms into the designs of their buildings. This is Otto Wagner's Majolica House in Vienna, built around 1898, and it's a really significant example of the Austrian use of the Art Nouveau line work. Other significant works of Otto Wagner include the Karlspatz Stambad Station in Vienna, done in 1900, and the Austrian Postal Savings Bank in Vienna. Wagner's way of modifying Art Nouveau decoration in a classical manner didn't really find favor with some of the pupils who broke away to form the secession with him. One was Joseph Hoffmann, who left to form the Wiener Werkstatt, an Austrian equivalent of the arts and crafts movement. So a good example of his work is the Stocklet Palace in Brussels. Basically, what you're seeing here is people withdrawing from the academy and then having a little bit of internal fighting and saying, we've got to go our separate ways as well. Hoffmann and Moser founded the Wiener Werkstatt in 1903 as a fine arts society with the goal of reforming the applied arts. So basically looking a little bit more towards the arts and crafts than some of their fellow Vienna secessionists. The tea service on the left was made for the Wiener Werkstatt, and it was what you see on the right, which is called the Sitz machine, which contributes straight lines and bentwood curves and has an adjustable back. On the tea service, the only decoration except for the inset jewels is a single thin horizontal line of raised dots near the bottom of each container. You can see a similar motif on the chair as well. Something else to just note here, on the 14th of June, 1905, Gustav Klimt and other artists left the Vienna secession as well due to differences of opinion over artistic concepts, basically breaking up the band. So, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, the Secessionist building displayed art from several other influential artists, such as Max Klinger, Eugene Grasset, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and Arnold Böcklin. Charles Rennie Mackintosh was a very unique and important figure, although his work, as I mentioned earlier, is extremely difficult to classify. It really straddles a lot of different time periods and styles. Arts and crafts, Art Nouveau, he's closely associated with the Vienna secession, although he's also actually Scottish by birth, and sometimes you see his work simply classified as Glasgow style, which is the city he was born in. Mackintosh and his future wife, Margaret MacDonald, her sister, Frances MacDonald, and Frances's future husband, Herbert McNair, were all fellow students who developed the elements of their style and their design aesthetic together at school. The four, as they were called, worked together on several projects, but it was the partnership of Mackintosh and Margaret MacDonald that actually defined the style, with furniture forms that recall the arts and crafts objects and curvilinear ornament that evidence Art Nouveau. This is his most noted design, including the Glasgow School of Art in 1897. Charles Rennie Mackintosh's work was extremely influential abroad, most notably in Vienna, and he exchanged ideas with Austrian designers such as Joseph Hoffmann, so you might see a bit of likeness in his work as to Joseph's. This is Hill House. It was designed in 1902. A few things I want to point out to you in the interior of this home, designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his wife Margaret MacDonald. You see a recurring detail, which we call his stylized rose motif. It's a little pink stylized rose design. And here, we'll see it again in a door detail. So his interior color schemes are characteristically all white and black with some pastel accents, particularly this pastel pink stylized rose. This chair has an extremely exaggerated ladder back with slim horizontal and checkerboard cresting. It was designed in 1902 for Hill House, one of Mackintosh's most important commissions. I think it also takes on a little bit of a characteristic of some of Frank Lloyd Wright's chairs, where we see those really tall, elongated backs. So, the House for an Art Lover is a building that was constructed present day, 1989 and to 1996. But it was based on 1901 design by Charles Rennie Mackintosh with his wife, Margaret MacDonald, from Glasgow, Scotland. But it's an incredible example of what Mackintosh's work looked like. So again, it's called the House for an Art Lover. And here, again, we see some of the characteristic interior aesthetics of Mackintosh. Macintosh designed several tea rooms. The Willow Tea Rooms from 1904 is particularly well known. These that you're looking at here are actually process sketches for the Willow Tea Room project. Here you see the Willow chair, which was designed for the Willow Tea Rooms. But another characteristic of Macintosh is known for is the decorative sort of geometric cutouts that create bold contrasts of solids and voids. So if you look at the backs of some of his pieces, you see solids and then you see these void cutouts. One of the most distinctive Macintosh designs, this chair, circa 1897, was made for his first major commission, the Argyle Street Tea Rooms in Glasgow. The unusual high back gave a feeling of privacy to diners, and that was one of his purposes in making these chairs in the design that he did, was to sort of give this illusion of privacy by having such a large back. This is in the Macintosh house in Glasgow. Two rooms were combined to form an open, L-shaped space. Macintosh furnished it with his own designs, which are considerably rectilinear with visible joints, plain straight legs, and rough textured finishes. Walls are enhanced by silver patina paintings that Margaret had done, particularly with some of those romantic fantasy figures, floral forms, and stylized rose motifs. Moving on, I wanted to talk about a style of education that really did work. So it's during this time that the first truly professional school of architecture is established. It's called the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The school developed a rigorous and organized program with a distinctive teaching method that was generally adopted by almost all design and architecture schools around the world. Previously, the way that you would have learned to practice architecture would be through apprenticeship or self-teaching. Those are the most common forms of schooling in architecture. But the École developed a program that included classroom lectures on history, construction, and other specialized topics. In their design teaching method, students were given a written program of requirements for a building that was desired by an imaginary client. Each student prepared designs under direction of a critic who operated a design studio or workroom. On a given date, all of the designs by many students in the class were presented as elaborate drawings to be critiqued and judged by a jury of established professionals. So for any of you that are design students, this should be sounding really familiar. High marks in the judging earned a diploma that certified a high level of achievement and skill. And this Beaux-Arts method was so successful that it attracted students from all over the world and is the way that we still conduct schooling in architecture and interior design today. So in conclusion, I have a short 10-minute video that you can use as a really fast summary of all of this information.